Very abridged version of the talk. I'm just going to focus predominantly on what we've been learning so far in the Optimism ecosystem and what we plan on proposing for 2025 and what we can learn from that in the Filecoin world. This is a condensed version of what we're going to talk about further at Funding the Commons later today, where we're actually going to deep dive into the results and numbers and things like that. But let's dive into it. So what we've learned from retrofunding so far, I think it's important to remember that retrofunding is not a fixed mechanism. Even in the Optimism Collective, it is a highly evolutionary kind of process, and the mechanism is changing very quickly round over round. So from retrofunding 3 last year, we've already gone through 4 rounds of iteration, and the program design's changed quite a bit. And to synthesize the things that we've learned from those 4 rounds, we've learned that there is this very complicated dynamic between humans and data. Humans are really good at relative comparisons between 2 projects. If I look at 2 projects, if I look at 2 visions of the world that I want, those are the types of things that human beings are really good at. Human beings are terrible at allocations. And for the most part, I think we've been advocating strongly that we actually move away from a system where humans allocate to projects, because a human is not good at knowing whether this project deserves 1, 2, 4, or 8x more than this other project. Data is incredibly good at that, and data is very good at providing comprehensive coverage of things that you may not necessarily have expected, but it's terrible at the nuances of things that would be clearly intuitive to a human being. So things that are immediately obvious, like notions of quality, humans are going to be a lot better at providing those types of subjective judgments. So we are evolving the program based on some of these insights. And the other thing that we're learning very quickly, which we're going to go into more detail this afternoon about, is that humans, don't ask them what they want, because they're going to tell you something very different. It's classic, product. If I put my classic product hat on, it's very much the case that when you show people results, they will end up telling you things and react in ways that are not consistent with what you asked them to predict in the first place. So reviewing some of our core assumptions of why we're even doing programs this way in the first place, I think we are pursuing these types of mechanisms because we believe that a free market is going to be much better at innovation than asking some centralized committee to spec every single feature out. And we don't want to create a centralized team of creating specs and bounties for every single strategic thing on the path. We do believe that in order to 100x the economy, 1000x the economy, there are going to be things that we don't think of, and retroactively rewarding that impact is going to be much more effective in driving innovation than centralized planning. We do also believe that measurement is critical for understanding experimentation. I completely agree with Iwaki's answer earlier that this is going to be a pluralist thing, and I think of a pluralist experimentation space as every potential variation of these types of funding programs could exist, and we need to have a consistent way of knowing whether or not we're pushing the needle forward and which one's pushing the needle forward the most, not just if it's pushing the needle forward at all. Full disclosure, we don't work for the foundation, but we are one of a few teams that are very active in the collective in pushing the mechanism and building the mechanism for retrofunding forward. These are the types of things that we're proposing in 2025. We are moving away from purely thinking about retroactive impact and thinking about how can we use retrofunding as a way to drive growth in the economy. I think there's a clear vision that we want to 10x the economy. In the Optimism world, that's going to look totally different than what it looks like in the Filecoin world. Let's workshop later today what that looks like in the Filecoin world. But in order to 10x the economy, we need to focus. And so we're arguing for continuous, we call them missions in the Optimism world. You can call them tracks, but effectively continuous missions that drive 2 predominant focus areas. One is on-chain builders, bringing economic value to the ecosystem, and developer tooling, which basically accelerates the velocity of people shipping these types of applications in the network. The broader collective will be involved in normative decisions. So for example, do we want to incentivize AI bots? Do we want to be, or do we really want to focus on applications where there's real users? Are there particular use cases that we really care about? Do we really want to be funding like the heavy hitters that are going to drive and pivot TVL to the ecosystem, or do we want to focus on funding the promising upstarts that are going to drive the future economy? These are the types of things that we're going to start engaging with the collective on in a broader value systems driven way. And in the actual reward allocations, it's going to be we're advocating for something that's significantly more expert driven, metrics informed, metrics optimized, to actually fund projects in the way that best optimizes for the growth targets that we actually care about. So there's going to be much more of a focus on funding for net new public goods, net new innovation, and discovering relative value between these types of things. So for example, in the Filecoin world, it could be we want to create better experiences, better developer experiences for data onboarding. It might be the case that we want to be rewarding more types of transactions on chain. Let's talk about that in the Filecoin setting, which we'll do more in the workshop. Oops, wrong direction. Practically speaking, the proposal that we have on the table right now of how this would work in an annualized basis is basically annually we'll have these types of normative discussions of what is the strategic directions that we want to go, what are the lines that we want to put in place of the things that we will fund, things that we won't fund. But on a rolling basis, what we're trying to move towards is instead of registering for individual rounds, we'll just have a unified project registry. So these are things where we've already filtered out for spam, already filtered out for things that are low quality, things that have high reputation, high value, things that are already KYC'd. And then on a monthly basis, we're going to be regularly looking at the types of impact outcomes that are generated from these cohorts. We're going to have expert groups that will consist of a heterogeneous set of people that are experts in economic policy design, people that are experts in the particular ecosystems, people that are experts in understanding the data and the statistics behind delivering significant outcome changes. And with this group of experts, we're going to leverage metrics to basically define the reward allocations that we think are going to drive towards the outcomes that we care about. And over time, we can develop more and more sophisticated metrics of how we're going to measure this. And we will be experimenting with more and more sophisticated mechanisms for making better decisions. One of the things that I'm really excited about is that, how does this interplay with things like prediction markets, for example? How does this interplay with things like AI and LLMs? How does this interplay with, how do we just make better decisions in general, regardless of whether we're using a human set of badge holders or, a set of algorithms? So what we'll be regularly measuring then is average unit of impact rewarded per allocation, metrics and how close we are to what governance wants and how aligned we are, stakeholder satisfaction in terms of different stakeholders in the ecosystem, including different chains in the super chain, whether or not they believe that this is driving the growth outcomes that they care about, and whether or not we're going to start doing things like cohort analysis across every permutation of cohorts that could exist and understanding whether or not any particular cohort is the thing that we should be betting on. As a summary of how we discover impact, this is something that is very, very iterative. And we want to start by making simple comparisons between projects. After that, we want to understand which measurable reasons are a reason why a project might be outperforming another. And then we'll use that to basically iterate and tackle more and more challenging comparisons between two. So a classic example, so in general, we are currently here right now as an ecosystem, and we want to get to a world where we're producing metrics that are less gameable, much more advanced, and things where we can understand longitudinally over time whether or not it's driving the relative change that we care about. So as a really practical, naive example, I'm sure this could be debunked in 2 seconds if you talk to anybody from the Filecoin Foundation. I can imagine a world where we basically, maybe one output target that we have is one where we want to grow the Filecoin economy by rewarding the highest quality data onboarders or storage clients that are bringing real quality use cases on chain. What would that look like? In the beginning, you're going to start with something that is really naive in terms of metrics. So maybe you're targeting things like rewarding storage deals. And that produces, two types of outcomes, right? One set of outcomes is one where, maybe startup A is generating a bunch of unnecessary storage deals. It gets to 1 million transactions. And scenario B, which is clearly better, which is there's a high quality startup that's actually bringing, quote unquote, quality use cases on chain into the network. But it has a significantly lower set of metrics, right? This is where human beings are really useful. We do need the data to understand what's going on, but human beings are going to be intuitively being able to tell you that scenario B is significantly better than scenario A. And so now we're going to start to iterate on these metrics. So for example, you might start to incorporate things like diversity of retrievals, quality of individual addresses, quality of individual, like quality of data that's onboarded, all sorts of different things that you're going to want to measure to basically refine your definition of what is good. What is good is clearly a subjective thing, but it needs to be informed by objective measurements. So just practically speaking, this is kind of the scenario that we were kind of talking about, where in the beginning, this is where we are right now, where we're just measuring things that are really naive, really gameable, but we want to start interacting with collective governance in a really interactive way to basically suss out which of these metrics are effective at driving what types of subjective outcomes that we care about. Because ultimately, yeah, only human beings can tell us what is good. We started prototyping a bunch of this stuff relatively recently. We do have like a prototype that we did, at ETH Global literally a couple of weeks ago, where we got a bunch of recognition from awesome partners in that ecosystem, including Polygon and Uniswap and the Nouns DAO. And we've started building out this product experience of easily setting up a retro fund to accept project registrations, and then basically producing regular automatic payouts, not dissimilar to what the folks in the Drips community have been talking about, what the folks in the Spark and Station community have been talking about, but give governance the ability to refine and weight these metrics over time and basically do this in a highly iterative experimental way. In this particular prototype, we ended up creating an on-chain splits contract, but in the Filecoin ecosystem, we're very excited to integrate with the Drips network to be able to do something similar. But these are basically a very dynamic, automatic on-chain way to distribute funds, and then an application that basically gives us the ability to adjust and learn from the different metrics that are coming out of a system like OSO to help us tweak this over time. We had a really fun, just like small retro round that we did as part of the hackathon with like $1,000 of people who were grinding hard at the hackathon. But you can start to see how this actually evolves to something bigger that we could do in both the Filecoin and Optimism ecosystems. But we want to make it trivially easy to launch one of these funds, create this network of funding, and reward retroactively a public goods network. Just like a quick snapshot of like what this looks like in the splits world and what we actually ended up funding. But you can imagine this dynamic list of projects that are being funded that's where we have some kind of on-chain oracle that's allocating impact. We're refining this impact score over time and producing funding allocations that we believe are going to drive towards the outcomes that we care about. So lots to talk about. We can deep dive into this in the workshop later and in the talks at Funding the Commons.